Welcome to part 4 of this tutorial series on SQL Server 2016. This part of the series is going to explain a bit about SQL Server Security, so we're going to explain about databases, logins, users, roles and schemas. So the video is primarily about security and how you connect to databases, but we're going to get started with a quick look at how you create new databases and a few of the basic properties you can modify when you do that. So we'll explain things about the database owner and a few of its other properties, and then we'll have a quick overview of the main database objects. The second half of the video is going to focus on the security aspect, so we'll start by talking about server logins and connections, then we'll talk about users and databases, then we'll look at the various server and database roles that you can assign to users and logins, and finally we'll finish off with a quick look at what schemas are and how you can use them to control permissions. So quite a lot to do here. It's a fairly complex, nerdy, fairly boring video to be fair, but it's nice background information just before we get started finally creating databases. So let's get started. In the previous video in this series, we looked at some of the system databases that get created automatically whenever you install SQL Server. We're going to start this video by showing you how you can start creating your own databases. And to begin with, I've already opened up SQL Server Management Studio, and I'm just about to connect to the SQL 2016 training instance that we created in the first video in this series. So if I click the Connect button, that'll give me access to the Databases folder. Now, one single instance of SQL Server can hold up to 32,767 different databases. Obviously, we're not going to create anywhere near that many for the purposes of this tutorial. We just want to create one to start with. And there are a couple of different ways you can create databases, but the simplest, most convenient way to show you to avoid having to learn how to write much complicated code is to simply right-click on the Databases folder, choose New Database to launch the New Database dialog box. Now technically all we need to do here is enter a sensible database name and then click the OK button. There are several other options available on the dialog box. There are a couple of different pages to go to and lots of properties to browse through, but all the default options will be absolutely fine for creating a simple database. So all I'm going to do is click into the database name box and give my database a sensible name. Now there are a few simple rules to follow when you name databases, but you won't go far wrong if you just stick to a combination of letters and numbers. Try not to use punctuation characters, although some are allowed. That includes spaces actually. You're allowed to use spaces in the names of your databases. You will have a slightly easier time of things later on if you don't use spaces in database names. Saves you a little tiny bit of typing later when you're referencing your databases. So I'm going to think of a really inventive, sensible name for my database. I'm going to call mine Test Database. And then having done that, all I need to do is click OK down at the bottom of the dialog box, and that will create my database for me. We should see the test database appears in the Databases folder. It's all a bit too easy really, isn't it? I don't know what your DBAs complain about. Now because we're logged in as the system administrator for this instance of SQL Server, it's just as simple for us to delete the database as it was to create it in the first place. Approach this with caution in the real world, but just for demonstration purposes, we haven't added any objects to the database yet. We can happily right-click on it and choose Delete. That'll display a dialog box, and all we need to do at that point is click the OK button, and that will delete the database and of course any objects contained inside it, including all the data. So once I click OK, the database is now gone. Now we saw that there were quite a few other options available when you create a new database, and although you won't need to change many, if any of them, to follow this tutorial series, it is nice to know at least a little bit about some of the basic options. So let's right click the database folder again and choose New Database, and we'll get the New Database dialog box reappearing. I'm going to create a new database this time. I'm just going to give it a slightly shorter name. I'm going to call it TestDB, again without any punctuation characters or spaces. Then let's have a quick look at some of the other options available. So the first option we've got below database name is called Owner. Now ownership is a concept in SQL Server whereby every object must be owned by something, and the database owner in this case will have unrestricted permissions to do absolutely everything with the database. The owner is set to the default at this point, which if you followed the install process that we showed you in the first video of the series, will currently be you. It will be your Windows user account. Just to show you what other options you can choose here, I'm actually going to have to close down this dialog box for a moment. I'm just going to cancel the dialog box and open up the Security folder, which is the second node down from the Databases folder in the server list. So if I go to the Security folder and then just expand the Logins folder, I'm going to talk a little bit more about logins shortly. But if I then go back to the Databases folder and choose New Database, and I'll put in a database name again, choose TestDB, then if I look at the owner and look at the little ellipsis button at the right hand side, I can click on this to see a list of other types of things I can select from. So you'll see that the the object types I'm allowed to use for the database owner is one of the logins from this logins security folder. If I click the browse button here, it will show me the same list that I'm just looking at in the logins folder here. So the default is the system administrator account, which, as I say, should be your Windows user account if you were following the same process as we went through in the first video of the series. I'm not going to bother changing that, there's no real reason to do so in this case, so I'm just going to cancel out that dialog box and leave the owner as the default. The next bit of information the dialog box shows you are the names of any files that will be created when you create the database. So 2 files get created by default when you create a new SQL Server database. The first one here is called testDB, and that's the main data file for the database. Its type there says rows data. Then there's also a log file that gets created, which stores a transaction log, so it keeps track of any changes made to the data when you insert records or delete them or modify them. Just to show you where those files live, you shouldn't really need to see this or manipulate these in any way, but if I open a Windows Explorer window and then browse to the root of my C drive and then into Program Files, and then I'm looking for the folder in which I installed Microsoft SQL Server, which conveniently enough is called Microsoft SQL Server. And then in there I've got a whole bunch of different folders corresponding to different versions and instances of SQL. So the one I'm looking for here is called MS SQL 13 SQL 2016 Training. So obviously this is related to the instance of SQL that we installed in video 1. And MS SQL is the database engine component, as opposed to MSRS, which is the reporting services, and AS, which is analysis services. So if I go into the MS SQL folder, and then the MS SQL folder in there, and then finally into the data folder in there, I'll see I've got a great big long list of different files corresponding to, in this case, all of the system databases. Now you remember these hopefully from the previous video. We had the master database, model, MSDB, and tempDB. And each one of these has got at least one single primary data file and one single transaction log file. The tempDB database has actually got multiple different data files. It's got a bunch of secondary data files as well. So for large databases, you'll often find, and you can do this yourself as an administrator, you can create multiple different secondary data files, spread them across multiple locations. We're not going to do that in our case, of course. We're just going to show you what happens when I click the Add button to create this database. I'll find that I get these 2 new files created and living in that folder. They'll get deleted automatically as well. If I go back to the server list and I find my testDB and right-click and delete it, just as I did before. When I click OK, and then again browse back to my data folder, I'll find those 2 files have now been deleted as well. Just a few other options worthwhile mentioning. If I close down this Windows Explorer window and then go back to create a new database yet again, I can right-click and choose New Database, and I'll call it testDB one more time. And then let's have a look on the options page of the dialog box. The first option here is called Collation, and this is to do with how text is treated when you do simple operations like sorting. You may remember when we first installed SQL Server in the first video in the series that we set the default collation to Latin 1, and then we chose that it was case insensitive and accent sensitive. So if I scroll down far enough, I'll find eventually that same setting, Latin 1 general, case insensitive, CI, and accent sensitive. Should you decide that for this particular database you want any other type, and we'll talk about the implications of some of these things when we are writing queries later on in the series, then you can feel free to choose a different option. For now, I'm just going to stick with the default. Just to quickly mention what the other main settings here are for, recovery model affects how the backup and restore feature works. So we're using a full recovery model for this database, meaning we'll get the maximum amount of information about transactions that occur in the database. Compatibility level affects the latest version of SQL Server supported by this database. So ours is set to SQL Server 2016, which is fine, we're in SQL Server 2016 for this series. Then we've also got containment type. Contained databases are databases where essentially as much information as possible is stored in a single entity, making it more easy to port to different servers. So for instance, user information and login information is stored in a single database rather than spread across the system databases and the actual database itself. I'll talk a little bit more about contained databases when we talk about users and logins a bit later on in this video. So for now we're just going to leave the containment type set to none. Now obviously there are lots more properties available down at the bottom of this dialog box, and I'm certainly not intending to go through every single last one of these properties. That would make for an even more boring video than the one you're watching. So what I will say is that if you want to find out any information about what these properties mean, there's a dedicated help button at the top of this little dialog box here. So if you click the help button, that will launch you into a web browser and it takes you off to the Microsoft Developer Network site, and then you'll get a page dedicated to this page of the dialog box, and each one of those individual properties is explained in small amounts of detail, but with further links to give you more information about how they work in a huge amount of detail. So I'll leave that up to you. I'm not going to change any more settings. I'm just going to close down that web browser, and then all I'm going to do, heading back to the general page, making sure I'm creating testDB with the default owner, click OK to create our basic test database that we'll use for the next part of the video. Now, we mentioned in the previous video in the series that any new database you create is based on the model template database, and that's one of the system databases. If I expand the system databases folder, the model database is sitting in there. So whenever you create your own new database, any objects that belong to the model database are copied into the new database. So let's have a quick look inside our testDB database to see what's being created for us. Now, there are lots of different types of database object that we're going to be covering in detail both in this video and later parts of the series, but just to give you a quick flavour for what you should expect to see in the various different folders here. Tables, of course, are the most important part, I think, of the entire database. Tables contain the raw data of your database, all the rows and columns and individual bits of data that make up your database. You won't find much in the tables folder at this point, apart from a few empty system-generated tables, so there's system tables, file tables and external tables, unless, of course, there were some tables inserted into the model database. When your database finally does have some tables in it, database diagrams are a great way to create a visual representation of how those tables are related. So in a later video in the series, we'll talk about creating relational databases and joining primary keys to foreign keys and other exciting sounding techniques like that, and we'll use database diagrams to show a nice visual representation of how those things are related. A view is often described as a virtual table, so again, when you do actually have some real tables in your database, you can use a view to pull together information from multiple different tables and present it together in a single continuous, view. The name's fairly self-explanatory. We'll create views again a bit later on in this series, but for now you may be interested to know that there's quite a lot of system views already in your database. If you expand the views folder, then expand the system views folder, there's lots and lots of information already stored in here. Now, these take information from some of the system tables that are part of the SQL Server instance that you've installed. So again, we'll talk about these in a bit more detail later on. For now, I'm just going to collapse the system views and then collapse the views folder as well. We're not going to talk about external resources or synonyms much, if at all, in this series, so that leads us next onto the wonderfully named Programmability folder. Now, we actually already have a bunch of videos from a previous series which describes how to create many of the object types stored in here. So we've got things like store procedures, which are essentially programs that you can write that are stored in your database and can be executed to perform various tasks. We've also got functions of various different types, like table valued and scalar valued. So they can return tables of data, or they can return values if you call them in your queries. As I say, we've already got videos that describe how to create many of these things, so we'll probably create some slightly more updated videos just as part of this series which go over this topic again. But for now, if you're interested, we've got an entirely different series all about SQL Server programming, so let's leave that folder alone for now. Now, I'm not going to cover the service broker or the storage folder as part of this series, so that leaves us just with the security folder right down at the bottom of the list. If I expand that, you'll see there's a variety of items in here, and these are all used to control who's allowed access to and what specific things they can do to various objects in the database. So it's quite an important folder, and as we're logged in as a system administrator, we've got access to manipulate many of these things. There are three main items here. There's users, roles and schemas, and for the second half of this video I just want to explain quickly how all these things fit together and what basic things you can do to manipulate these as a system administrator. Okay, so let's get some of the basic ideas out of the way with first. If you want to be able to connect to a SQL Server, you must have a valid login stored in the logins folder of the security folder, which is stored at the server level. So if I just collapse the databases folder for the time being, just so we can focus more clearly on the security folder, we've got this logins folder that lists out all the valid logins currently added to the server. If you remember when we installed SQL Server in the first video of this series, we assigned ourselves as the default system administrator, so you should see an account related to your Windows user account here. The other items that you'll see in this folder will be related to various other users and groups and computers, and also default service accounts for the various aspects of SQL Server that have been installed. You might also be able to make out the SA account, which is the default system administrator account for servers running in SQL Server authentication mode. And we'll talk a bit more about authentication modes in just a moment. Now, each login on the server must also be associated with a server role, and the server role determines what this login will be allowed to do on the server. So if I expand the server roles folder, you'll get a basic idea about what each role is for based on simply their names, but if you want more detail, then a quick Google for SQL Server server roles will give you much more detailed information about each of these. Sysadmin is a fairly simple one to explain though. System Administrator, this is the role that we're assigned to by default if you installed SQL Server the way that we did in the first video in the series. If you did want to modify the server roles for any login, or you wanted to add a new role, then what you can do is right click on a login and choose Properties, and then on the dialog box that appears you can choose the server roles page and see which roles that login is associated with. So of course, as we said, we're assigned to the sysadmin server role, and we're also assigned to the public role. Now, although I can remove myself from the sysadmin role, I don't actually want to do that. I find that I can't remove myself from the public server role. So any new login that you create is assigned to the public server role by default. I'm just going to click cancel. I don't want to make any changes to my own server roles at this point. And what we'll do next is we'll create a new login and assign a server role to that new login. Just as for creating databases, there are a couple of ways you can create new logins, but the most convenient way for this video is to show you how to use the dialog box to do it. So just like for a database, if you right click on the logins folder, you can choose to create a new login, and when you do that, you'll get a new login dialog box. The first thing we need to do is specify a login name, and the exact way you do that depends on which authentication mode you're using. If you remember the first video in this series, we configured our SQL Server installation to use Windows authentication mode. That's the mode that's recommended by Microsoft as it's more robust and secure. If you've got Windows authentication mode set, then essentially what you need to do here is enter the name of any user or group, or indeed use the search button here to launch a dialog box. It helps you to select the users or groups. I'm not going to do that in this example because it's going to mean logging in and logging out of different user accounts on this machine to demonstrate what I want to demonstrate. So just temporarily what we're going to do is generate a SQL Server authenticated login. So I'm going to switch to SQL Server authentication, and then I'm going to create a brand new login name. I'm just going to make this up another exciting name. I'm going to call it test login. And then we'll need to enter a password for the login as well. So this won't take any information from our Windows credentials, of course. The user will need to enter a password when they choose to connect to the server. So make your password nice and robust and a strong password using all the standard techniques you'll have heard about for creating strong passwords. I'm going to create one that's reasonably easy to remember, and I'll need to enter that twice, of course. So let's just do that quickly. There are a few other options associated with the password. So you've got this option here to enforce a password policy, which if that box is checked, it essentially ensures that you've got complex passwords involving a combination of numbers and letters and doesn't include the username in the password and so on. You can also make the password expire and ensure that the user must change their password the next time they log in. I'm just going to uncheck the enforce password policy box just for the purposes of this demonstration. I want to keep things quick and simple just to demonstrate the things I need to demonstrate here. Down at the bottom of the dialog box, you can see that you can change the default database that's opened when the login connects to the server, and also the default language that they use. There's no point really here changing these from their default settings, so I'm going to leave those as they are. What I'm then going to do is head briefly to the server roles page, just to show us that, again, we're assigned to the public server role, and I can't uncheck that, and I could assign this user, or this login I should say, to any other server role as well. But for this example, I want to keep this particular login in just the public server role. So at that point I'm going to click OK, and I'll find that my new test login has appeared in the logins folder. Now, one small problem with the login that I've just created is that it's not using Windows authentication, it's using SQL Server authentication. And as you remember from the first video, we installed our server in Windows authentication mode. So if I try to create a new connection to this same database engine, and I'm going to change this so it's using SQL Server authentication rather than Windows authentication, and I'm going to change the login so it's test login, and I'm going to put in my test password as well. So when I do that and I try to click connect, it'll tell me that I've failed the login for this test login. It doesn't give me much more information than that, other than the error number, which is worthwhile if you're trying to Google for help. Use the error numbers that are created for you here as well. But in this case I know exactly what the error is because this server is currently configured in Windows authentication mode and not SQL Server authentication mode. So I'm going to click OK at this point and cancel the Connect to Server dialog box. To allow this login to be authenticated, I've got to change the authentication mode of the server. So I can do that as a system administrator by right-clicking the server node at the top of the list, choosing Properties, and then from the dialog box that appears, heading on to the Security page and changing to SQL Server and Windows authentication mode. If I click OK at that point, I'll then be informed that I need to restart my service, essentially, to make these changes take effect. So I'm going to click OK, I'm going to disconnect from the server, I'll need to reconnect to it anyway, and then I'm going to go back to the Start menu and choose to open up SQL Server Configuration Manager. In here I can right-click on my SQL 2016 training instance and then choose to restart it. And once the progress bars have done their thing and stopped the service and then restarted it, I can go back to SQL Server Management Studio. I'm going to leave SQL Server Configuration Manager open for the time being. We'll probably come back here before the end of the video to restart the servers again. But now that that's happened, I should be able to switch back to SQL Server Management Studio. First of all, I'm going to connect using my Windows credentials. So I'm going to connect to the database engine using Windows Authentication to connect as my system administrator role, and then I'm also going to choose to connect again to the same database engine, but this time using SQL Server Authentication. So I've got test login entered as a login, then I can enter my password, and then once I've done all of that, and I can click the connect button, and now I'm connected as my test login. Now, even though I'm connected as this test login, I'm not going to be able to do much with the items in the server at this point. If I choose to expand the databases folder, I'll see the databases that exist, but there won't be much that I can do with them. So for instance, if I try to open up the testDB database, it tries to expand, but then eventually what's going to happen is I'll be presented with an error message at some point in the near future, hopefully. There we go. So the database isn't accessible to me. The reason for that is I've not been added as a user to that database with this particular login. So, as I'm logged in as both System Administrator and this test login, I can change things in one instance, one connection, and then have those affect the second connection. So let's have a quick look. I want to make sure that I'm added as a user to the testDB database. Now, there are three main elements associated with creating users in a database. They're all contained in the same folder within the database, so start by expanding your testDB, and then you can expand the security folder in there. And the first three folders that appear, users, roles, and schemas, are the three main things you need to know about. Now, a user stored at the database level has to be connected to a login stored at the server level. So if I expand the security folder at the server level, and then the logins folder in there, every login can have a single user created in each database. So essentially the login is mapped to a user in a database. You can map the same login to a different user in as many different databases as you like, and for that reason, if you find that you're creating the same user in lots and lots of different databases, it might be a good idea to create users in the model database instead. So the model database, as you remember, is the template for all new databases, has a security folder and a users folder in there. We're not going to do this in the model database, we're going to create our new user in the testDB database. If you expand the users folder of the database, you'll see that it already contains several items, and the most important one of these is DBO, or the database owner user. Now, DBO is essentially just an alias for the default system administrator account or login. So if I were to right-click on the DBO user and choose to view properties, you'll see the dialog box tells me that although this user is called DBO in this database, the actual login name from which it's mapped is the same one as my system administrator user account. So that's ysal/Andrew.Gould. So essentially that tells you that any login can be represented as any different username in any database. But as I said before, you can only map one login once per database. So if I were to just cancel from this dialog box and I were to try to create a new user based on that same login, then that would fail. Now, what a user is allowed to do in a database is determined by which permissions it's been assigned. And you can assign permissions to a user in a couple of different ways. You can go about this process in a quite long-winded fashion and assign individual explicit permissions to each user. Alternatively, and slightly more efficiently, you can use database roles. So these are similar to the server roles we looked at earlier on for logins. A database has got database roles, so if you look in the roles folder, there's a database roles folder in there, and again the names of these provide you with some clue as to what these roles allow. The DB owner database role is almost the equivalent, I suppose, of the system administrator role for the server. So the DB owner allows you to do anything you like to the database. So if I can just again take you to the properties dialog box for the DBO user and head on to the membership page, this shows you which roles this user is a member of. So you'll see that this one is assigned to or is a member of the DB owner role, meaning that DBO can essentially do anything it wants to this entire database, including deleting it, as it turns out. The final piece of the user puzzle is something called a schema, and you'll see the schemas folder sits just below the roles folder in the security folder of the database. Just while I still have this properties dialog box displayed for the DBO user, you'll see that it also has an owned schemas page. So each schema that exists, and a schema is essentially just a way to organize and grant permissions to various items in the database. Each schema must be owned by something in the database, so you can see that my DBO user doesn't actually own any schemas because there are no checked boxes. It doesn't even own the DB owner schema. So let me just cancel out of this dialog box, and then let's have a look in the schemas folder itself. So if I expand the schemas folder and then have a look at the names of the items in there, we'll find that there's a schema in there called DB owner. If you want to know which item in the database does own this schema, you can right click on it and then choose properties. And on the general page of the dialog box, it will tell you which item owns this schema. So the DB owner schema is also owned by something called DB owner. Now what this actually refers to is not as circular as it seems. This DB owner refers to the database role DB owner. So a schema can be owned by both a database role or a user in the database. Now I'll come back and explain a little bit more in detail about schemas in just a moment, but all three items are important: users, roles and schemas if you're going to create users in a database. So let's just cancel this dialog box and let's actually create a new user associated with our test login from our server. Hopefully, as you've come to expect by now in SQL Server Management Studio, to create a new item, you can simply right-click on the appropriate folder and choose the top option. So in this case, right-click on Users and choose New User. That'll give you a dialog box then that allows you to configure the new user. The first thing you have to specify is what type of user you're creating. In this case, we're specifying it's a SQL user with a login. So this is associated with a login in the logins folder which I've just managed to hide at the bottom of the screen there. So a login in the security folder at the level of the server. There's an option there that says SQL user without a login, so it is possible to create a SQL user that's confined just to this database and doesn't correspond to any login in the logins folder at the server level. You can only do that, however, if you've set up the database to be contained, and I mentioned that property just earlier on when we created our new database. We haven't created a contained database. We can't do this. We can't choose a SQL user without a login. We can also choose various other options, including the Windows user. So if we were using Windows authentication only, we could map this to a Windows user. But in this case, we're going to choose SQL user with login. The next thing I need to do is specify a username, and as we saw before, the username doesn't necessarily need to correspond to the name of the login. So let's create a user. In this case, I'm going to call it test user, following my sensible, boring naming convention from all the other items I've created. So I've got test user, then I need to associate it with a login. So in this case, I could either type in the login name, or more conveniently, I can select it by clicking the ellipsis button and then browsing for all the logins available to this server. So I scroll down, I'll find my test login, and I can check that box, click OK, and then click OK again. The final thing I can do is associate the default schema to this user as well. So the default schema determines if this user creates any objects, what schema those objects will belong to by default. I don't have to specify anything here. I can choose one of the existing schemas by clicking the Browse button and then browse again to select one. I can even make up a brand new schema name here that doesn't even exist yet. So in fact, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a new schema called, guess what? Test schema. At least I'm consistent if nothing else. You can then move on to the Own Schemas page, and here you can specify the ownership of any schemas that belong to the database. Now the only schema that I'd like this user to own is the one that we haven't yet created, the one called test schema. We can reference its name even though it doesn't yet exist here. So if I go back to the own schemas page, there's no schema that I want this user to own. So then let's move on to the membership page, and this lets me assign the user to any of the built-in database roles. So what I'd like this user to be able to do, I'd like them to be able to read any data from any table, so I'm going to assign them to the data reader role. I'd also like them to be able to modify any data in those tables, so I'm going to assign them to the data writer role. I'd also like this particular user to be allowed to create and alter any existing objects in the database. So I'm going to assign them to the DDL admin role, so DDL data definition language, so that allows me to create and alter objects. If I wanted to, I could also head onto the Securables page here, and here what I can do is assign individual explicit permissions for separate objects. So the way this page works is I can head onto the search box at the top, and I can choose to create or look for specific objects in the dialog box and select object types, and then I've got a great big long list of different types of objects I can select. So for instance, if I looked at the stored procedures and clicked OK, and then hit the Browse button to browse for stored procedures that belong to this database, there's a whole bunch of system stored procedures. So I could select as many or as few of these as I liked, and when I clicked OK and OK again, that will be added to my list of securables. So securables are objects in the database that can have security assigned to them, if that makes sense. And then for each item in this list, I can choose exactly what this user is allowed to do to it. So you can imagine how time-consuming a process that is for individual items and individual users and individual explicit permissions. So I'm not actually going to bother assigning anything here. I'm not going to change any of these settings for this single store procedure. At this point, all I'm going to do is click the OK button to create this basic user who's called test user with a mapped to the test login stored in the logins folder of the server, creating or having a default schema of test schema, which doesn't yet exist, and is a member of 3 separate database roles: data reader, data writer, and DDL admin. So if I click OK at this point, that new user will have been created. Okay, so at this point, let's just tidy up the window a little bit. I'm going to collapse the schemas folder and the roles folder, and I'm also going to collapse the security folder for the server, and then what I'm going to try to do is connect to this database. So if I choose to refresh this server that was logged into by my test user, my test login, if I just refresh this and then expand the databases folder again, and again that might take a little while for that to happen. Eventually, when we get there, I can expand the testdb folder, and this time I'll find that I can actually access it. One final thing that we're going to do is make sure that the schema that we assigned as the test user's default schema, inventively called test schema, actually exists, because currently it doesn't. So if I expand the schemas folder and then right click on that and choose new schema, we're going to create a new schema name called test schema. I'll try to call it test schema. There we go. The owner of the schema, I'm going to set the owner of the schema to be the test user. So if I click the search button, click browse, and then scroll through, you'll see I can pick from a range of database roles and users. So I'm going to choose my test user by checking the box and clicking OK and clicking OK again. It is also possible to use a schema to assign permissions to both users and database roles. If I go into the permissions page and then click the search button at the top, I can search for users, database roles, and application roles. If I click the browse button, there's a fairly limited set of options in here, just because I've not added that many additional users and roles to the database, of course. But I could choose a user here, and then in the same way as previously, in fact let me just very quickly demonstrate this, fairly pointless choosing the test user as that's the owner for the schema anyway, but I could then choose what permissions are granted to that user. I'm not going to do that in this case. In fact, in this case I'm not going to tick any of these boxes. I'm just going to click the OK button. So having not checked any boxes, I haven't actually modified any of the permission settings. If I click OK, that will be sufficient to create the test schema, and that's tied in now with the test user. If I view the properties, the default, if I go back there on the general page, I've got the default schema as test schema, and I'm also going to make this test user the owner of that schema, which you can see has already been done as it turns out. So if I click OK and then just collapse up these folders again just to tidy up a little bit, we're basically done in terms of creating users in the database. So let's have a look at a couple of the very basic implications of what we've done here so far. So currently we've got two connections to the same SQL Server using two separate logins. So we've got the default System Administrator login, which in this case is me, and we've also got our new test login that we created in this video. Now we've already established that the System Administrator login can do whatever it wants to the server, including deleting databases and creating new ones from scratch. We saw earlier on that the test login, which has only been assigned to the public server role, can't even connect to a database unless it's been mapped to a user in that database. So of course I can't create databases or delete them. All I should be able to do with the test login and test user is according to the permissions that I've assigned to the test user in that database. Now because I've assigned the test user to the DDL admin role, that should enable me to create tables in the database. So let's give that a quick try. I'm going to expand the tables folder and then right click on tables and choose new table. I'm going to use the table designer to do this just for simplicity. I'll get a little warning that I'm not logged in as the database owner or administrator, so I might not be able to save changes, but because I've assigned this user to the DDL admin role, I know that I will be allowed to do that. So if I click OK, that'll give me the basic table designer. I'd just also like to display the Properties window here as well, so I'm going to head to the View menu and choose Properties window, just to demonstrate that the default schema that this table will be created in is the test schema, the one that we created earlier on. We're going to talk a lot more about table design in the next video in the series, so I'm not going to go into any detail here whatsoever other than to create a simple column name, which I'm going to call, let's call it Test Column 1, and then I'm going to use the default data type, which I'm not going to explain anything about at this point, and then I should just be able to close and save this. And I'll just leave it with the default name of table 1, and it will be created in the test schema. So if I click OK, that table should now exist. So if I refresh my tables folder with the test login, and then do the same thing, I might not need to do this for the system administrator, I can just expand the tables folder and that table is viewed there as well. I can also create tables as the system administrator, or in this case the DBO database user, which is mapped to the system administrator, of course. So if I right click on the tables folder in this connection and choose new table, we will see this time the default schema assigned to this table is DBO. I can actually change this. I should have mentioned this previously. I can change the schema that the table belongs to when I create it, or indeed any object, but in this case I'm going to leave it in the DBO schema. So let's call this one, again I'll call it test column 2, and again I'll use the default data type and then choose to close down that table, choose yes to save its changes, and I can call it table 1 again. Because this will belong to a different schema, the table is allowed to have the same name because its scope is different. So I'm going to click OK, and I've got another table 1, and again if I refresh the tables folder, and I'll do that again for the test login connection as well, I've now got tables in two different schemas. Just to demonstrate that we can affect what this user is allowed to do, I'm going to go back to the System Administrator connection and then expand the Security folder, and then I'm going to expand Users and then right click on Test User and choose Properties. I'm then going to go to the Membership page and I'm going to remove its membership from the DDL Admin database role. When I click OK this time, then collapse the Security folder again, if I try to go back to the tables folder and I try to do anything now in terms of creating tables, so I can right click on tables and choose new table, I'll get the same warning as previously that I might not be able to save changes, but I'm going to click OK and ignore it again. I'm going to call my new column test column 3, and then I'll use the same data type as previously. It should belong to the test schema, and then if I choose to close the table down and choose yes to save the changes, click OK to call it table 2, this time I'll be prevented completely, saying that I don't have create table permissions. So I'm going to click no, I don't want to continue attempting to save the table, and that'll close it down. The removal from the DDL admin role also means that I can't delete objects from the database, so if I try to delete the table 1 table that belongs to the DBO schema, I'll find that I won't be allowed to do that. If I click OK in the dialog box, I'm prevented from doing so because I don't have permission. If I try to do this, however, for the table which belongs to the test schema, because the test user is the owner of the test schema, it means that implicitly that user also owns any object that belongs to that schema. So if I try to delete table 1 from the test schema, in this case I'll find that I can do that. I can create more elaborate arrangements of permissions and ownership of various objects, and just to maybe very quickly demonstrate, just to wrap up some of the things you can do, what I'm going to do is head back to the administrator connection, and I'm going to create a brand new table that belongs to the test schema. So I'm going to right click in tables, choose new and choose table. And I'll give this column I'll give it a really random name, just the first few keys I press on the keyboard just to give it a name, and it's got a data type there as well. I'm going to change the schema from DBO to test schema, and then I'm going to choose to close this down and choose yes to save the changes, and that will create the new table, table 2, if I refresh the tables folder, in the test schema, and that will of course belong or be visible to both connections. What I'm now going to do is change ownership of the test schema. So if I head back to the security folder in the system administrator connection, and then go to the schemas folder, and then I'm going to right click on test schema and choose properties. The first thing I'm going to do is change the ownership. So rather than use test user as the owner, I'm going to browse for DBO. So remember, that's just essentially an alias for my system administrator account. So if I click OK to update that and then click OK again, what I'm now going to do is use the test schema to modify the permissions for objects in the test schema for the test user. So if I right click test schema and choose properties and then click permissions, I'm going to search for the test user. So I'm going to browse for test user, then click OK and then click OK again. Now, currently the test user isn't allowed to create or delete or alter objects in the database because we've removed test user from the DDL admin database role. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grant permission to the test user for items in the test schema to alter them. And actually, I think that's probably it. That's all I want to do. I don't want it to be able to delete objects in there. I could allow it to insert data into there, but I can do that anyway because the test user is a member of the data reader and data writer role, so I don't need to do that. Let's just then at that point, with the alter statement written, if I click OK and then scroll back down again into the test login connection. So just to establish first that I'm not allowed to make changes to normal tables or ones that don't belong to the test schema. If I try to right click on table 1 that belongs to the DBO schema and then choose design and then click OK just to confirm that I want to attempt to do that, you'll see that in this case table 1 is set to read only, so I don't have enough rights to make changes to that table. So I can close down that table. But what I can do, because I have permission, or the alter permission, for items in the test schema, if I right click on this table and choose design, again I'll get the same little warning, but I can click OK and you'll see here I am allowed to make changes. So I can create a new column with an equally useless name, but that's not important at this stage. Then if I choose to close the table down and click yes to save the changes, click yes anyway just to confirm that I want to do that, and you'll see that this table now has that new column created as well. So there's a brief little flavour for what you can do with users, roles and schemas. Okay, well that's basically the end of this video, apart from a little bit of tidying up to reset things back to the way they were before we began. So I'm just going to disconnect from my test login connection, so I'm going to right click and choose disconnect, and then I'm going to view the properties of my system administrator connection. I'm going to right click on that and choose properties. What I'm going to do then is head onto the security page, and if you remember we reset the server authentication back to SQL Server and Windows Authentication earlier on. So I'm going to reset it back to Windows Authentication mode only and then click OK, and I'll get a little warning about that not having any effect until I've restarted the server. So to do that I'm going to go back to SQL Server Configuration Manager, then I can right click on SQL Server and choose Restart, making sure it's the correct instance of course, so it's SQL 2016 Training. And then a couple of very last things I'm going to do just to finish off tidying up is I'm going to delete the database and the extra login that I created earlier on. So when the service is restarted, I ought to be able to head back to SQL Server Management Studio, and then I can restart the service by, oh, it's restarted itself, there it goes. And then if I can go back to the databases folder first of all, I can right click on test.db and choose delete. I can then click OK to confirm that. And then finally I can go into the security folder, go into logins, find my test login, right click and delete that as well. Once I've clicked OK and clicked OK again, that's everything reset back to its original state. So that's the end of the video. Hope you've enjoyed that one and you've got a bit more of a feel for how basic security works in SQL Server. What we'll do in the next video is move on and start talking about how to create tables and a bit of an interesting discussion about the various different data types for columns in tables. Thanks for watching, see you next time. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the Wisel website where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.